Up. And we're so happy you're all here today. And thank you, Stu, for giving your lecture today on the Middle East.
Well, thank you, Diane. I thank everybody for coming and giving me company. What I want to do today, what I'd like to accomplish the most is to provide, first of all, to provide some perspective on the situation in the Middle East, and to give a few benchmarks for the future. What I'm not going to get into is what's going on right now. All of you are inundated with things from the media, and you all have formed your own opinions, and that's fine. And I just don't want to get into that. I'm going to try and put a framework around things and try and put some perspective so that we can think about what could happen as we go forward over the next few decades. So with that in mind, I want to start off by talking, and I will leave plenty of time at the end for questions, and I'll be glad to answer as many questions as you might have, and I will take whatever time is necessary to do that. I want to start off by talking about the composition of the Middle East. Just over here to my left, I have the National Geographic's Atlas of the Middle East, which covers all of the countries, starting with Turkey and going all the way down to the tip of Yemen, including the Persian Gulf countries, and also including Egypt and Cyprus. Cyprus is a historical country that's had a lot of links to the Middle East, but not so much today. Also, a number of other people consider that the Middle East stretches all the way across North Africa, from Egypt all the way to the Atlantic. So I will touch a little bit on that, on those countries. But what I want to start off with is to give you an idea of the history a little bit. I think you all know that starting about 3500 BCE.
Stuart, should we all mute?
What's that?
Yes, we should all mute.
All right. Well, I'm not in charge of those things like I am with my class, so that's great. The history of the Middle East, starting about 3500 BCE, it began to be, particularly as the Sumerian city-state civilization broke out and started expeditions to the north. The Middle East began a process that's lasted ever since. It's been an area of conflict and commerce almost continuously since 3500 BC. And virtually every area within the Middle East has, at one time or another, been either a very powerful state on its own or a regional power of some significance. So that every country has some type of past to look back to that they can fantasize that, again, they can be a regional power the way they were before. And just to give a quick rundown on what some of those areas were, if we look at, you had in the area that's now Iraq and Syria and Iran, you had the Assyrians, the Babylonians, several Islamic caliphates in both Damascus and Babylon, the Persian Empire, and several Iranian empires. We had the series of Turkish empires started off with the Hittites around 1200 BC and stretched through the Byzantines, various other Turkic empires, and ended up with the Ottomans, which went out of existence in right after World War I. And across North Africa, of course, you had the ancient Egyptian empire, followed by several Islam versions of Islamic empires in Egypt. Had the Phoenicians, and they established settlements. They started out in what's now Lebanon, established cities, colonies across North Africa, particularly in Carthage. You also had the Almohad and Almoravid empires, which were in Morocco, and they both in successive periods right around between about 1000 AD and 1200 AD, they conquered Spain. So in addition, you had the Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, and the Crusaders, all establishing major outposts in what we now have considered to be the Middle East. Some of them were larger than others, but all of them had multiple outposts. And in the colonial period, which, let's say, reached its apex right after World War I, the British and the French, with some assistance from the Italians, established a group of artificial states throughout the Middle East, which we're now dealing with the fallout from those currently. And there were also Jewish states in the Middle East that you had the states of the original Jewish settlers came into the Middle East around 1400 BC, general consensus of that. And within a couple of 100 years, they had begun to set up their own states. And for many, many years, two Jewish states existed, one being Judah, which was in the southern part. It included Jerusalem, and it included the southern part of what is now Israel and into some of Egypt. And the state of Israel, which was in the north, and it went in the northern, is what's now northern Israel, into Lebanon and Syria. These states were conquered on a number of occasions. And of course, you all possibly remember the time when most of the citizens of Jerusalem, etc., were taken into slavery in Babylonia around 500 BC. But in all cases, the defeat of the different Jewish states were as a result of internal divisions and external attacks. External, first from the Assyrians, then from the Babylonians, and then finally from the Romans. Then there was another Jewish state that was established in the Middle East, much less well known. It stretched from what is now southern Yemen around the port of Aden, and it stretched across the Red Sea into the corresponding area of what's now Ethiopia. But it was a major Jewish state there, which lasted until just before the birth of Muhammad and the creation of Islam. The U.S. involvement in the Middle East began, interestingly enough, in 1776, when we sent a mission from the U.S., went to Egypt to meet with the rulers of Egypt and met with several clerics. And throughout the next couple of 100 years, our involvement in the Middle East the U.S. involvement in the Middle East involved us trying to sending people over, whether they were, some of them were missionaries of various different Christian faiths, mostly Methodist, Baptists, and also Mormons. And they established settlements in different parts of the Middle East, in the Palestine area particularly. And their object was to convert what they called heathens to Christianity. They were unsuccessful in doing that. There were practically no converts, although several Christian sects did establish roots in Jerusalem, as they still have today. But the U.S. involvement in the Middle East has pretty much been trying to convert the people of the Middle East to something that we believed in, whether it was first, it was Christianity, then it became democracy and capitalism. We're still trying to do that. And by and large, our efforts of trying to have our values imposed on the various different tribes, clans, ethnic groups, religious groups of the Middle East has been unsuccessful. And whatever we're trying to convert them to, it has been relatively unsuccessful. And ever since World War II, when we first, at the end of World War II, President Roosevelt, coming back from a conference in Iran right shortly before his death, was on an American warship, and he stopped in the Red Sea off the port of Jeddah of Saudi Arabia and met with the Saudi king at that point. And they had a meeting of the minds, mutually complementary, very different exchanges, very friendly. And we opened up commercial ties with what became Saudi Arabia, which had just been solidified under the rule of the Saud family. And so oil was injected into the picture, and we were big factors in the creation of what's now Saudi Aramco. It was Aramco for many years, just, and an American controlled company. Now it's controlled by the Saudis. And in Iran and Iraq, the significant oil reserves there were controlled by the British. So this is a very rough history of the Middle East. And then after World War I, as the Ottoman Empire broke up, the British and the French, Sykes-Picot Agreement, if you remember, divided up the area into spheres of influence, the French having some, the English having some, and these, what turned out to be reasonably artificial states, were created by the French and the English. What's now Syria, what's now Jordan, what's now Iraq, all were set up by drawing lines on maps, which basically paid very little attention to local tribal influences or interests, and in most cases put somebody in charge who came from somewhere else. One of the things that was done was that if you remember Lawrence of Arabia, and he went to enlist the ruler of what was one of the two major rulers of the areas of became Saudi Arabia, who was competing with the Saud family for influence, Faisal family. They lost. And as a consolation prize, and because they had helped the British during the invasions of which the British made into Iraq and into the Palestine area against the Ottoman Empire, they were given the king of, they established a monarchy in Iraq, which was headed up by one of the sons of Faisal, a Saudi, and the other son was made the king of what became Jordan. It's called Transjordan at the time. And so the current king of Jordan is really a Saudi. The Iraqi king was deposed in one of the struggles afterwards, but these creation of these states, none of which were economically viable, became the cause of what's transpired lately, and in particular, the creation of the British mandate over Palestine, which was created right after the World War I. The British were given the mandate there, and they had to determine how to deal with the population of Palestinians and also of Jews who were emigrating from Europe and elsewhere into the area, which became was fairly strong, but became a flood after the Holocaust and World War II. So the situation that has developed in the Palestine area was developed on the basis of what the British were trying to do to control the situation that had arisen from the intermingling of these two ethnic groups and has continued to bubble up ever since. So that's basically when that started. And if we look at we move towards the present, a number of different countries in the Middle East, looking back both to their historical origins and to their current prowess, have decided that they have developed ambitions to be regional powers. It's certainly true in Iran, which long before even the Shah came, and remember the Shah of Iran who was deposed in 1979 by the current government of Iran. His father was an officer in the Ottoman army and only came to power to establish the dynasty in 1925. But Iran has a long history of being regional powers in that area, going back to the days of Darius and Xerxes, etc. And so they've always harbored these ambitions to be a regional power, particularly around the Gulf. The Saudis, ever since they discovered mammoth oil reserves on their land, and it became this gusher of profits flowed to them, and then subsequently to the Emiratis, mostly from natural gas, but the UAE, which had been British protectorates, they began to want to flex their economic muscle in the area. They had under the original Saud back in the 1700s, he was basically the original Saud who established his power in Riyadh before he expanded it, was a rough contemporary of George Washington. And he hooked up with a very hard right, a very fundamentalist cleric, and then they established their empire, as you would, on the peninsula there, and it was only enhanced by the wealth that came in from oil. The Turks, having been a long history of being powerful regional players going all the way back to the Hittites, but going through the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantines, everything have harbored all kinds of notions that they could be major players in the Middle East. Now, they don't happen to be Arabs, they're Turks, so that it makes it a little more difficult. And the Ottoman Empire didn't leave too many satisfied customers in its wake. So, but the Turks have not actually managed, at least recently, their economy terribly well. So it's inhibited their ability to expand. The Egyptians, as the largest population in the Middle East, have also harbored regional ambitions. You remember they sponsored an invasion of Yemen back in the time of Nasser, and Nasser had formed the United Arab Republic along with Syria back in the older days. But Egypt has never been able to muster the economic muscle to go through to exert real regional power. They've mostly been the recipient of aid from other people. If you go across North Africa, the Libyans were combined into 3 states, put 3 separate, decidedly separate groups together to form what's now Libya, was done by the Italians. And Libya has been a turmoil ever since. And now it is basically a failed state. Morocco has been very consistent with its monarchy stretching back hundreds of years and has been relatively economically self-sufficient, as has Tunisia, but both of them were French colonies for many, many years. So at present, you have the North Africans. They're sitting there, and if you look beneath North Africa, you have a civil war of significant proportions going on in Sudan. You have Somalia has been a failed state for years. Ethiopia is undergoing a civil war. There, and the states that stretches across the Sahel, right across the Sahara, right beneath North Africa, Chad, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, those states have been in constant turmoil, and the terrorism that was used to be in Syria and Iraq, ISIS and Al Qaeda, have mostly moved to that area. And there have been several coups in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. ECOWAS, the organization that keeps together the Western African nations, have had those 3 coup nations secede from ECOWAS. And so the North African states are in constant fear of the area beneath them catching on fire and engulfing them. So their involvement in the rest of the Middle East has been relatively minor because their particular neighborhood has grown so perilous. I mentioned economics, and I will mention it again in a little bit, but virtually none of the Middle East countries are economically self-sufficient. Yes, you have oil bubbling up, and with Saudi, the United Arab Emirates, to a certain extent, Qatar and Bahrain, but lesser extent from them. Qatar has gotten into several financial scrapes, but Egypt, Syria, Iraq, the Palestinians, even Turkey, they're all reliant on outside financing to stay afloat. So you have a region that, and I believe, and that we are going to go through a period here where the Middle East will be in a major stage of transition, and what emerges in the Middle East by mid-century, let's say, is going to be completely different. Not that I'm going to be around to see it. So I guess I can make safe projections and nobody will be able to say that I'm wrong. I won't be around. But the change that is the Middle East is going to be undergoing over the next number of years, I think is going to be profound because, and we'll get into it a little later when I talk about more about Israel and Palestine. But we've got a region that it depends on outside aid. Those of you who are in my class now or have been in my classes before know that I believe that we're running with high debt levels in the developed countries and more and more expenses to be required to deal with the climate impacts. There's going to be a shortage of free cash flow starting no later than 2030. So the ability and the desire to fund these different countries, fund and to keep them afloat, we hardly a week goes by without hearing from the World Food Organization, for example, that there is about to be a famine in Yemen or a famine in Sudan or a famine in Ethiopia and Tigray, etc. And the funding that has come to deal with those conditions is less than 40% of what's been asked for by the UN. So I think the appetite for outside entities to fund Middle Eastern entities is going to wane, and that is a shame because without keeping these countries afloat, it will increase the number of migrants that are heading for Europe. So that's something to keep an eye on. But we also have what is called the axis of resistance. Now, Iran has established a group of proxies militant proxy organizations whose job is to basically twofold. One, to destabilize and weaken the West as much as possible, and two is to ensure the eventual destruction of Israel. So you have, if you look at the placement of these proxy entities, the militias, the Shiite militias in Iraq, also the Shiite militias in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then the Houthis in Yemen, in northern Yemen. All of them, those are all Shiites of one sort or another. Hamas is an outlier in the sense that it is a militant organization, a militant Islamic organization, which meets many of the goals of Iran, but they happen to be Shia, Sunni, not Shia. So they're of a different religious sect. It doesn't seem to matter if you've got a common purpose. And the same thing is true with the Houthis. The Houthis, without getting too deep into the Shia religion, but they follow a series of hidden imams, which the one of which you follow is supposed to appear at some point in time, like the second coming, and revitalize everything. Well, in the case of 80% of all of the Shia people, the imam they follow is the 12th imam, and so they're called Twelvers. The Houthis follow the 5th imam, they're called Fivers, and they're the Zaidis. Houthi is the name of the family that is the most important in control of that area of the Houthi. The Houthi and were composed of a bunch of mountain tribes in North Yemen, very similar to, let's say, the Afghans, warring mountain tribes who were always fighting each other. If they couldn't get together on a common enemy, then they fought each other. The Houthi family were able to unite them and say, look, what we can do is come down out of the mountains. We can take over, get rid of the people who are running Yemen, take over Sana'a, and control the economy and the oil and various things like that. So and that's what happened. So the Houthis came down out of the mountains. They do control most of Yemen, not the southern part, but the southern part was a British colony and it was artificially attached to the rest of Yemen. So it's been separate for most of its history. But even though the Houthis are of a different sect of Shiism than Iran, Iran has supplied it with weapons, supplied it with training, military training, and their role is they're sitting there on the flank of the Saudis. And so they're in a strategic position as well, along with the Hezbollah, which is sitting at the north of Israel, and the other militia groups are sitting along the flanks of Israel and Jordan. So the axis of resistance has been taken over to some degree by the Chinese. It was established, and the regional ideas that fueled it were in place. But as the Russians first in the north began to destabilize the West, and then began to have greater success against NATO and the EU, particularly after their invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese hooked up with them and with the Iranians, and the Chinese have been for some period of time trying to establish an economic and financial system that was separate from the West and would not be subject to any of its financial controls or sanctions or anything like that. And they've included the Iranians as their sort of the point group in the south and the Russians in the north. And the Chinese have supplied both the Russians and the Iranians with a great deal of money through trade, helping them sell their oil and gas, and then supplying them with weapons and technology, which has increased the expertise of, say, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and also helped the Russians. So it's part of that Chinese octopus, if you want to think of it that way, is the Iranian arm reaching out and being the axis of resistance in the Middle East, which is aimed to reduce the influence of the West throughout the Middle East, and in particular to reduce or eliminate the power of Israel. So that's the axis of resistance. Now, the U.S. involvement in, as I mentioned, we started back in 1776, but if we look at it in a more recent frame, you can remember that under Eisenhower, under Reagan, under George Clinton and George W. Bush, we had significant involvements in the Middle East. I think you'll remember when the peacekeepers in Lebanon, they got their barracks blown up, killed over 200 of them. We were attempting to be peacemakers in the situation, particularly the one that was going on with the Lebanese civil war, where Syria was trying to control Lebanon. We had our involvement, we also had places where people were, our troops were staying in Saudi Arabia, where the Iranians were successful in blowing up a facility that housed them. And so we've, in addition to the war in Iraq and the situation in Syria, which was our attempt to oppose the Syrian government of Assad. And we still have troops in Syria that are about 900. And that was where the recent deaths of 3 of the US soldiers were due to their involvement. They were a supply base in Jordan that was supplying one of our outposts in Syria. So we have in the Middle East today, we have about 45,000 troops.
Woo.
I know it's a surprise. Most of them are in the Gulf, but I will read just quickly where they are so that you can get an idea. 3,000 in Jordan, 2,500 in Iraq, 900 in Syria, 8,000 in Qatar, 9,000 in Bahrain, that's a naval base, 13,500 in Kuwait, 3,500 in the UAE, 500 in Oman, and 1,885 in Turkey. So we have a substantial presence in the Middle East, much more than people generally realize. And while we say that we're trying to keep ISIS from rising up again, which is why we have the things in Syria, we're helping the Kurds, who were a long time neglected ethnic group that now we're spread out across the Middle East. There's an area of them in northwest Iran. As you know, there's an autonomous group in northern Iraq of Kurds. And then along the Turkish border in Syria is this area that has been occupied and established by the Kurds and the Kurdish military. And we've helped these Kurds, which is a little tricky for us because Turks hate the Kurds and have for years, claim they're terrorists and everything else. And we're there protecting the Kurds, but then Turkey is a member of NATO. So it adds to the complexities of the situation and the complexities of the Middle East with all of the ethnic groups and the clans and the family relationships, etc., that we often in our diplomatic efforts or our planning for policy ignore. Let's look now at Israel-Palestine situation and what we might be able to expect from it. As I mentioned, the British mandate in Palestine was established after World War I. For that period of time and throughout all the time since, there have been some peaceful interactions between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but by and large, you've also had a number of different conflicts, clashes, atrocities on both sides pretty continuously from that period of the British mandate up until now. If you try and read a history, and I've read a number of them, it all depends on where the author is coming from. There are very few that are able to write an unbiased history. The Israeli writer Morris is one of them. one of the very few. But by and large, you have you read one account, and it's the other side was committing most of the atrocities and doing all the bad things, and we were just innocent, trying to get along. And then you go and read something that was written by the other side, and they say the same thing. So you've had constant clashes in contents ever since the British Mandate was established. And as the number of settlers, largely from Europe, came into the area of Palestine, it put more pressure on the land use and the ability to get along with each other, and the conflicts increased, and the protests against the British and their rule also increased. And two of the eventual Israeli prime ministers were heads of what they themselves called terrorist groups when they were fighting the British throughout the period of the Mandate. That's Begin and Shamir. Both were part of the Irgun terrorist group that fought the British, blew up buildings and assassinated soldiers and things like that. And then they eventually came into the mainstream of what became the Likud party. So it's a long history of conflict that finally the British threw up their hands. They tried to divide the Mandate up into two, and they said, we're pulling out. That was 1948. We had the declaration of the state of Israel, founding of the state of Israel, the almost immediate recognition of President Truman. Then the Palestinians, and again, it depends on what account you read, but essentially they said, we don't want this fragment that you've given us. We want the whole thing. And Arab armies from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, and from Iraq all attacked the Israelis, thinking that it was a fledgling state and they could sweep through and easily conquer them. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And ever since then, you've had constant claims and accounts of grievances arising from land being stolen and various different atrocities being committed. So it's built up this giant trail of grievances on both sides of, and you see them playing out today. But the Israeli state was able to fight wars against various different combinations of Arabs under various different conditions in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, and then in 2006 when invading Lebanon. So it's been a whole series of wars that have gone on, and there were two in so-called intifadas, which were uprisings of the Palestinian people in between 1987 and 1993, and between 2000 and 2005. So you have this long list of, and every time you had a conflict of some sort or a change in boundaries of some sort, you built up a fresh level of grievances and desires. And in the process, obstacles to any kind of peaceful resolution of the story. I can diverge a little bit because I had some part in connections of this. When I was in the military, well, when I was in college, I was in a seminar run by Henry Kissinger. And in that seminar, who sat next to me was a gentleman that I got to know quite well over the course of that semester. And he turned out, as I found out later, but under a different name, the person that I met and got to know turned out to be one of the senior Israeli intelligence officials. And when I went into the military, I happened to acquire an intelligence expertise in an area that was considered to be useful to the Israeli military. And so I worked with them with the permission of the U.S. Army when I was in the early 1960s. I worked with them on something that wasn't the use of side-looking airborne radar, which could look out and get pictures or infrared impressions up to 90 kilometers away. So you could fly it behind the borders of Israel and see out. And it turned out, much to my surprise, when 1967 turned out, that this technique had been used to basically identify and wipe out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. So I had that involvement. And that was in the early 1960s when I was dealing with the IDF at that time. You have to remember, and I was admittedly very much of a Zionist at the time, very much in support of the cause of Zionism. At that time, what is now the West Bank and East Jerusalem was then Jordan. What is now the Golan Heights was then Syria. All of that changed in the 1967 war. And it's just as an anecdote, when I went to an investment conference, which I used to go every year to one they held in Stockholm, Scandinavian Investment Conference. And on April 12th, 1983, Yasser Arafat arrived to give a speech before the parliament in Sweden. We were having our investment conference at the same time. And virtually all of the Swedish mobilized their troops so that the boats that I was staying in the Grand Hotel in Stockholm, which is right on the waterfront. They had patrol craft there, helicopters overhead. And when I looked out my window, I could see soldiers with guns on the roof of the opposite. And most of the conference people were evacuated from the hotel. For some reason, I was not. So I was able to obtain my 15 seconds of fame through that, because one morning I'm going out we were going to go to the conference and have the meetings and everything. And I'm waiting at the elevator. And in order to get in or out of the hotel, you had to be frisked and searched and everything. And I'm standing there, and out of the door, that was 5 doors away from my room, comes Yasser Arafat with his wife, who has a floor-length ermine coat on, exhibiting identification with the poor people, of course. And he was accompanied by 4 big camouflage attired bodyguards. So I'm standing waiting for the elevator, and there were some reporters there waiting, also sitting down. So he comes up to me and says in quite good English, "Oh, I hope I haven't inconvenienced you." And I said, no, not at all. I said, in fact, I have some friends in the Israeli Air Force who would like to be right here, right now. And with that, the bodyguards, I could hear the clicks of their, as they activated their weapons. And then Arafat laughed and everything. And that moment passed. But I don't speak Swedish. I didn't watch television, but the thing was on TV that night and it was in the paper the next morning. And so when I got on the bus to go to see the company we were going to go see the next morning, I got a standing ovation from everybody. And he said, he said, would you like me to autograph your book? I was holding a book that had just come out. Unfortunately, I have lost it. But so we autographed the book in pencil. I had pencil with me. And the book happened to be The Little Drummer Girl. I don't know if you have read the book. It was also a movie, but it was about a British actress who infiltrates the Palestinian organization and becomes a girlfriend of one of their leading members and work affects his assassination. So I thought that was good, and it was stupid of me to lose the book. But in any case, so I bring that all up because when we talk about two-state solution, which rolls off the tongue very easily, two-state solution, it sounds good. Everybody's been mentioning it for years. It happens to drive me nuts every time I hear it. And I've been hearing it a lot lately because nobody really has any idea of how you would pull this off. The one time that they came somewhat close, if you remember, the Oslo Accords in 1993 were signed by Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat in 1993 with Clinton there. And the Oslo Accords were actually, they weren't any agreement, but they were supposed to start a peace process. And there was a second Oslo Accord in 1995. But so Yitzhak Rabin signed this in 1993. In 1995, he was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli from the very, very far-right nationalist group, which now is what became the Settlers. And so, and all of the indications were that neither the people of the Palestinian community nor the people of Israel were particularly in favor of moving towards this solution. And what would that solution involve? It was based on UN Resolution 242, which caused that the starting point for figuring out how you're going to set up these states was that you go back to the pre-1967 boundaries. So the boundaries that existed when I was there talking to the IDF would be what we would be starting to make to put these states together. Now, in those days, even in 1967, there were very few settlers in what is the West Bank, or what some of the settlers call Judea and Samaria, when they claim that the Bible gave them God gave them the right to this territory. So now there are over 500,000 settlers in that area. And if you look at where the settlements are, they're on the high ground surrounding Palestinian villages and towns and cities. They're spread out throughout the West Bank. And and I've heard people talk about, well, what kind of a peace agreement that we would have now. I've heard people even mention UN Resolution 242, and that, well, we'll do that. We'll carve the state here, and the settlers will have the right to go back to Israel and be resettled or be part of the Palestinian state. And I say to myself, well, good luck to that. I mean, that is basically a non-starter. So even if you had two states, I mean, it would be exceedingly difficult to figure out exactly where are they going to be. And the West Bank is filled with concrete barriers dividing Palestinian settlements, etc., protecting roadways that lead to Israel. And that's just the beginning. I mean, and there's no guarantee. You'd still have basically large percentages of both populations that believe that what they should end up with is the whole thing, not one segment. So I listened to this, what I consider a very Pollyanna view of what could happen, and realized that for its entire existence, the Palestinian community around, whether they're in Gaza or whether they're in the West Bank, or even if they're in Jordan, because Jordan is over 60% Palestinian, basically depend and have depended on outside money for their sustenance. They are not in any way, shape, or form economically self-sufficient. The Gulf Arabs have been significant in giving them the money that's kept them alive. The Qataris were the main funders of Gaza, and the Emirates and the Saudis were mainly on the West Bank and in Jordan. Even Israel, with its admittedly very flourishing economy, we have been sending them several $billions every year, up to about $4 billion, largely because of the enormous military expenditures that have been made over the years and are still being made. But we are funding the Israeli government with billions of our dollars. So we don't have a situation that has any prospect of being economically viable. And the main sources of funds that have flowed into the area have come from the Gulf, the Gulf Arabs, who are dependent for their economic survival on hydrocarbon energy, which is, however you might want to estimate. I mean, it's not, its use may be going up for the near term, but long term, the object of all of the accords, whether it be the first Paris Agreement or the recent one in the Emirates, is to basically eliminate or greatly reduce the use of hydrocarbons. So their fund flow is not going to be long-term sustainable. So we're talking about an economically unviable situation, as well as one that involves political Pollyannism, as far as I'm concerned. Now we get to another aspect of it, and that is China. China is dependent on oil and gas from the Gulf region because they have virtually none of their own. They also import lots of raw materials from Africa. So the peace of and stability of the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf region, is exceedingly important to the Chinese. The Chinese, if you remember, had brokered a deal last year where they got the Iranians and the Saudis for the first time to exchange ambassadors. Now, the reason that the Gulf Arabs are feeling that they need Israel as much as they do is to some degree economic, certainly, but it also is that because they don't really trust the U.S., and I wonder why, to back them in a crisis. Want to make sure that they've got the Israeli military, which is the most sophisticated military in the area, on their side if things should blow up with Iran. China's long-term objective is to work out a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran in order to maintain the stability of the flow of energy to their economy. So you can think about what are the possibilities if they're able to do that. And all of a sudden, the dynamics of the Middle East change. So we have a region. I point out the obstacles of the impracticality of the so-called two-state solution. And I'm sarcastic about solution because you're still talking about drawing a border between two people who want the whole thing. But the impracticalities of that, plus the economic unviability of the entire area, and then the Russians moved into the Middle East as they established a military base and supported the Assad regime, and they have made ties with the Iranians, as have the Chinese. So you have two new powers that have been well-funded powers, which have moved in to try and displace the U.S. in the Middle East. And we don't know what the U.S. attitude about all this is going to be looking out after the presidential election, looking at our finances, a willingness of the people of this country to send money, continue to send money to the Middle East. Who would we back? Who would we not back? All of those questions are open, and you're dealing with not only a militarily volatile situation in the Middle East, but an economically very, very precarious situation there, and a transition that I think is in place already and will be accelerating as we go forward towards mid-century, where we will have a totally transformed Middle East with various different boundaries being different and different financing mechanisms and different military outlooks. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation and I'll accept whatever questions you might have about what's going on. Or criticisms if you think I'm totally full of it, which is not entirely impossible. So I'm ready to take questions, but I think, are you going to be selecting the questions, Diane?
Yeah, she's here.
All right. Anyway, go ahead. Who has?
Sure.
Did somebody just ask?
Okay, you asked for comment. There was what I thought was a terrific article in the Times Magazine on February 4th with multiple panels. You probably saw it.
Yes.
Yeah, and
I have.
I read that and thought I had better understanding of it, but how's anyone ever going to solve this mess? And I have no reason for optimism in it. I wondered, and what I particularly liked about this was the multiplicity of participants in it, so that you did not get just one person's point of view, as you mentioned in some of it earlier in your talk. I wondered though about the settlers who were going into the West Bank. You say 50,000 of them. Where? What is the West Bank? Who owns it? Who governs it? And are they settlers invaders?
Well, the history of settlers have been authorized by various different Israeli governments to take land in the West Bank and build settlements. The Israeli Knesset passes resolutions that allows them to do that. Sometimes they go and take the settlements and then ask for approval later. But the rest of the world, in effect, including us, considers most, if not all, of the settlements to be illegal because they involve groups of Israelis going and camping out on land, kicking the people off who were there, and building settlements. So you have that they've come from Israel into what's the West Bank. A number of them are from very far right groups, which I indicated earlier. A number of them believe that God gave the entire, they're called the Greater Israelite groups, gave them the area as theirs. And so the West Bank, which they call Judea and Samaria, is basically Greater Israel. So settlers are a problem, particularly since the settler groups were part of a key part of the coalition that put the recent Netanyahu government in power, so that some of the most aggressive of the ministers in his Ben Gvir, Smotrich, are from those groups and with those viewpoints, and are they're in charge, so they have the power, at least in Israel, to do what they want, and so the defense person in charge of national security distributed after October 7th, distributed weapons to all of the settlers that wanted them. So they're heavily armed.
Don't say anything.
And there is no authority that, particularly with the people in power now, that has any control over them. So that's the settler situation.
Who nominally owns the West Bank? What's the civil authority over it?
Well, you have the PLO, the Palestinian, or the Palestinian Authority, which was established right after the original Oslo Accords in 1993. But one of the things about all these peace negotiations are that when Secretary Blinken goes over there and talks to her, makes a statement about it, he basically addresses it as to what's going to happen after they've reformed the PLO, so that it's much more inclusive, and you move control out from under a boss and give it to somebody else. And on the Israeli side, that the next government that will succeed the Netanyahu government. So we're basically talking about a situation that presumes that governments are going to change, but the authority of the Palestinians is directly subject to what the Israeli government dictates. Their control is very weak. Yes, Paul.
Going back a little bit on history, Stuart, and why I don't disagree with your
final analysis, unfortunately. I wish I did, but I don't. But there have been innumerable examples where the Arabs, and you know it as well as I do, from 1937 on, have refused to recognize Israel in any form. And there have been many plans brought forward, and the Arabs have, quote, even you've heard all this before, they've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And most agreements, Stuart, are controversial in nature anyways. I mean, not everyone's gonna, a good agreement, no one's totally happy.
Good for
The
him.
fact that there are no agreements whatsoever right now, I don't know. I mean, you want to say the Arabs never had any decent leadership? They were afraid of an agreement?
Well, you're absolutely right that they, over the period of time, going all the way back to 1948, the Arab have refused to accept the existence of Israel. Then they began to pick off a few of them because they signed an agreement with the famous agreement between Sadat and Begin. Egypt recognized them. The Jordanians signed an agreement with them. One of the recent attempts was because the Saudis and the Emiratis have been working under the table with the Israelis for a while. There was an attempt that quite recently they thought they could put a deal together, the Biden administration did, that would get recognition on the part of the Saudis and the Emiratis, and then the other Arabs in the Gulf, the Qataris and the Bahrainis and the Omanis, to recognize Israel. And that was their idea of dealing with creating a situation which would be more stable. That is gone up in smoke to some degree, although the Saudi and Emirati governments are anxious to renew it. They've got to be careful because they don't like the militants at all, and none of them particularly are like the Palestinians, are in favor of the Palestinians. But the Arab street is up in arms about recent events, and so even the dictatorial regimes in Saudi Arabia and the UAE are being very careful, but they generally want to form an agreement with Israel because they want to have protection against Iran. So there have been some breaks in this situation, and it's been accelerated by the advancement of Iran and its proxies, has scared the other people. But when King Abdullah came to meet with Biden a couple of days ago, he said that if things didn't change, Jordan was going to pull out of the agreement they had signed, recognizing Israel. And so it's a dicey situation at the moment, Paul. But you're absolutely right that at every turn, the Arab states, either in concert or severally, have refused to go along with recognition of Israel.
Thank you, Stuart.
Anybody else have anything?
Yes, here's a tough one. I'm wondering how you see things playing out in Gaza once the fighting finally stops.
Well, you're assuming the fighting will stop. The answer is, I mean, I don't really know, but you've looked at what happened just in the last 2 days. They've discovered that the Egyptians were building a big fence to create a buffer zone behind the Rafah area, figuring that if there wasn't an attack on Rafah, that there would be up to 100,000 or 200,000 Palestinian Gazans that would leave, try and get into Egypt, and they're building a zone to try and contain them. There have been all kinds of different talks about setting up refugee camps or different camps. The preferred solution of the right wing of the Israeli government, particularly the settler-oriented ones, is to have the Gazans move to Egypt. Then they could inherit Gaza. Who is going to control the situation? Can they realign the Palestinian organization to be an effective governing body? That's been under discussion, and there are all kinds of things that have come out about that. We don't know if that's going to be successful. So I would say the answer to your question is basically up in the air, as to because ultimately the control of the solution will come down to the people who are going to finance it. But that's not what's going to happen in the next few months. It's going to be the Gulf Arab, the people who are going to be relied upon to finance it are going to be the Gulf Arabs and us. And what is it that we're willing to accept? But in the interim, there's going to be a lot of turmoil, and there's a lot of discussion back and forth, solutions or theories being proposed right and left, and no clear pathway is emerging. So I can't really give you a good answer. Yes, I can see the yellow hand up in the corner there.
Okay. Thank you for the history. I think that you certainly are very knowledgeable about what was going on in the past in the Middle East and what's going on right now. And you did partially answer the question I'm going to ask you, which is, what about our humanitarian responsibility? I just feel as though Israel is committing war crimes by using starvation as an act of war, bombing civilians. 28,000 people are dead, we are told. I don't personally find that acceptable.
Well, I can understand your view. I am not going to get into determining who is or is not committing war crimes. Both of those issues are before the International Court of Justice, and there are accusations back and forth on both sides. And what we have is a gigantic mess, tragic mess. To what degree our humanitarian feelings are going to be backed up by our money is a good question. And it has a great deal to do with the outcome of the 2024 election. And I'm not sure, because ultimately, if you have humanitarian feelings about the people who have been injured and displaced, then you're going to have to fund something that is going to alleviate that. And I don't know what our ultimate decision on that, or what the ultimate decision of the Gulf Arabs. That's where it lies. So it lies in Riyadh, in Doha, and in Washington, is basically where the outcome of the humanitarian thing is going to lie. And words are cheap, but what's going to happen when money is called for, I don't know.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? All right, well, in that case, I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Stu.
Thank you, Stu.
You have a very good
Thank you.
weekend.
Thank you very much.
It was
You're
amazing.
more than welcome.
Thank
Okay.
you, Stu.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're very knowledgeable.
It was great as
Thank you.
Okay.
Good show. Thanks, man.
Bye-bye, folks. You have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Stu. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.